In today's video, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with Jill Johnson Young, who is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked in hospice and does grief therapy. And she's going to share with us her own personal journey with grief as a double widow. Also, her experiences dealing with the healthcare system as part of a same sex couple, and her latest book, which is titled The Rebellious Widow, a practical guide to love and life after loss. So let's get on with the interview. Today, I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Jill Johnson Young. Jill is a licensed clinical social worker and an internationally renowned speaker, author, and co owner of Central Counseling Services, a large multi therapist mental health center. Jill is passionate about helping people navigate the loss of loved ones and in debunking the myth that there is one right way to grieve. She's the author of numerous books about grief for adults and children, including her most recent book, The Rebellious Widow, a practical guide to love and life after loss, which we'll be talking all about today. And you can learn more about Jill and her work at therebelliouswidow.com and jilljohnsonyoung.com. So, Jill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. Ever since we met on a Zoom call, and got to know a little bit about you, and I was just excited to have you as a guest and to hear more about your story and talk about grief because you have so much wisdom to share in your book.
Thank you. I kind of live in the world of grief and have my entire career.
Yeah, and I understand that. I mean, from reading the book, you're trained as a therapist, of course, so you have
Mhm.
professional expertise, but you have also dealt with your share of grief and loss as a two-time widow, I guess I can call it that, in your life. So I thought maybe we could start by having you just tell us a little bit about your own story.
Sure. In my career, I was the first social worker for our local AIDS project before we had the name AIDS. And when Ryan White was still very much part of the living world. And I was part of the losses that we had there, which were numerous and nonstop. And then I was able to, in my career as a social worker, you get to sort of meld and move, and it's a delightful career to have for people who don't like to be locked in, which I don't. I was able to do hospice in 2 states, as well as now in my private practice to be able to specialize in grief and loss and dementia and end of life and chronic illness, all the fun stuff. And in all of that, what I discovered, in addition to in my own life with the loss of both of my wives, is that most therapists are not really great at grief. In fact, some of them really suck at it. And I'm sorry, guys, it's really true. And they don't know what to say. And so they say all the things that nobody should say. So I was married for 23 years to Linda. And together we adopted our 2 children, and we were in the process of adopting a third when she died. We lived for a time in Florida where she discovered she had breast cancer. And, I will say, thank God we were in Florida at the time because we worked for a company and I worked for the hospice and we got all the right care because she was found with 14 positive nodes and she
Wow.
was already stage 3. And that was routine mammogram. So, ladies, get your mammograms. I'm going in for mine next week. With that, we were told she was going to be dead by December, and that was in July. I
Wow.
remember like this sort of tunnel opening up and the floor feeling like it wasn't really firm. And then I took a look at Linda's face and I just knew that I needed it needed to be about her. So she looked at the doctor and said, I'm going to focus on beating this. Jill's going to manage the illness and be the social worker, and we're going to beat this thing. And she did. She died cancer free. But we were in a car accident once we returned to California and had adopted our kids. And she shredded her ACL and she ended up in surgery. And after surgery, she got what they called pneumonia over and over again. And we were in the hospital one day and waiting for a pulmonology appointment that never seemed to happen. And the hospitalist pulled me aside and said, "Here, take a look at this." That's when we had light boxes, for those of you who remember
Mhm.
those, when we actually did real x-rays and they went on up there. And he said, "That's not pneumonia, that's pulmonary fibrosis. She's going to die. Take her home." And
Oh my
that's how we
gosh.
discovered she was terminally ill. So with pulmonary fibrosis, you get at most 5 years. And she made it to 3.5. And the pulmonary fibrosis came from her chemotherapy. So ultimately, the treatment for the cancer that saved her life and gave us that time is what took her life. While she was ill, she was very much the nurse that she always was. We got a plan, we got to get ready. She fought like crazy. She worked until 6 months before she died. And she started telling me after hospice started, "You have to marry Casper, the hospice nurse."
Mm.
And I said, "No, we're taking care of you right now." And Casper said, "Hospice comes back and does grief work. We don't come back and marry people." But she told everybody. She told the minister, the kids, my mom, everybody. This was the Linda plan. She had a 3-page bucket list, and Jill marrying Casper was on that list. And after she died, it turned out she was right. And I did
Hmm.
marry Casper, and it was a very good match. And we were very much in love. I broke all the freaking widow rules. I pissed off a whole bunch of people. And then, about 6 months into our marriage, Casper started with symptoms that made no sense whatsoever. They were global symptoms. And that turned out to be Lewy body dementia.
Oh
And
wow.
Lewy body dementia is a no win. All the dementias are, all 12 of them. You can't survive them. But early onset Lewy body dementia means you have 5 years or less. And she got 3. And she died in 2013. And part of my crew that took care of me while I was taking care of Casper included Stacy, who was the mortician who took care of and met with Linda to plan her funeral, and then came and took Linda at the time of her death. So she couldn't say she wasn't warned, because she saw all the crazies in our house, including us and all the pets and all the everybody. She came back because she started seeing blogs I was writing about trying to get Casper diagnosed and trying to take care of her. And I had a smaller group of people because I'd lost people who disagreed with how I grieved and disagreed with me being married again, because apparently someone thinks it's a democracy. And they get to vote on whether or not you get married. So after Casper's death, Stacy and I started seeing each other, and now I'm married to Stacy, the funeral director, and we've been together 8 years as of this month. How's that
Wow.
for a story?
Wow. What an incredible journey. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And I can't imagine these dual caregiving journeys must have been so intense for you back to back
Exhausting,
as they were.
absolutely exhausting.
Yeah, and you saw different types of caregiving, I would think, also, because
Yeah,
Linda with pulmonary fibrosis and Casper with dementia, different issues you were dealing with.
very different issues, although Lewy body dementia, bless its heart, ugliest dementia on the planet. My apologies to all the other dementias because they're ugly too. But Lewy body has Parkinsonism. And so you have falls, and you have trouble swallowing, and you have all the other things that go along with Parkinsonism, in addition to dementia, in addition to psychosis, which is the number one feature of Lewy body. So she'd have moments where she was completely out of it. She had moments where we were in different periods of time. I woke up one morning and I was told her parents had been there because we'd had a flood downstairs. And I said, "Well, that's inconvenient because I've been sleeping without any clothes on. I hope they didn't come up here." Because, you have to have a sense of humor when you're
Yeah,
dealing with this stuff.
yeah.
And, but then they snap back. So people with Lewy body remember the loss of memory. They remember the crazy. They remember what your face looked like when that was going on. They remember all of it. So between the two of them, it was a lot of energy. And that's why people who are widowed after having long illnesses wrapped around them do tend to remarry, and remarry sooner, because they did all their grief while they were caregiving.
Yeah, and you already alluded to the widow rules
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the title of your book being The Rebellious Widow. I assume that's where it comes from, but I was curious to have you explain what the widow rules are that you encountered.
Oh, the widow rules, they just suck. They really do. And what they are is basically how everyone else wants to manage the widow, managing her grief for their comfort. So don't smile too soon. Don't smile too often. Don't look too sad, though, because that makes us sad. Don't look too gloomy because that makes us feel bad for you. Don't say their name. Oh, wait, do say their name because then we'll think you've forgotten about them. And for God's sakes, don't remarry. Widowers, please remarry. Widows, not so much. There's a huge dichotomy. And it's crazy making because unless you've actually walked the walk, only you get to decide. It's like a scale for me. There's the Betty White, and then there's the Jill, and then there's everyone else in between. Right? Betty said she had Alan. She didn't need anyone else ever. She had her dogs. And I obviously needed someone else, and it was well matched, but I also need my dogs. You can land anywhere, but nobody should be able to tell you how to grieve. No one should try to say there are 5 stages because there aren't. No one should tell you that you have to finish 5 stages and get to acceptance because that's not reality. That's anticipatory grief before someone dies. And the widow rules are designed to make you grieve the way it makes other people comfortable.
Wow,
And it's not fair to widows.
yeah, that's such a good point. It's other people observing your grief process and wanting to control it or direct it a certain way instead of allowing you to have your own experience.
I left one job after Linda's death because I literally couldn't get any peace at work. Once I returned to work, I had people coming by telling me that I didn't look sad enough, or I looked too sad, or I shouldn't have returned so soon, or I should be doing more to keep myself busy. I'm thinking, I've got 2.5 kids. I'm in the middle of an adoption of a 16-year-old from group home care. I think I've got enough on my plate, folks. And I emailed my boss one day and said, I'm going to put black crepe paper over my cubby and I'm leaving for the day. I can't tolerate this anymore. These people need to stop.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the judgment. And I sometimes wonder if it comes from people who themselves haven't experienced grief. They just have ideas in their head from
100%.
maybe a movie they saw or something they read that makes them think they understand what this is about.
Yeah, dementia is the Notebook. That's the everything you need to know about dementia, which is utter BS. I hate that movie. Love James Garner. Hate that movie, right? Because it makes the expectations are just so wrong. And then, with grief, what you should imagine if you want to know how people who are grieving are feeling is that scene in the cemetery with Sally Field in Steel Magnolias, right?
Yes, yeah.
Just hit her, right? Because there's tears and there's sadness and there's anger and there's laughter and there's memories and it's all just wrapped up. That's real grief. But if you are in a lot of the widow groups, you'll see people say, if I hear one more person refer to my spouse's death akin to their divorce when they got to choose that, or their dog or their cat, grief shouldn't be compared. My loss of my wives is not the same as someone losing a child or a parent. I've lost a parent as well, and in-laws. That's a different kind of loss. But the way I look at grief is it's something that you deal with and you march through and you finish and you move into whatever new life you want to create, but you get to create it.
And you explained in the book that you and Linda actually spent time together while she was alive, going through anticipatory grief together, talking through
Yes,
it, working through it. So it's not like grief begins right at the moment of death and carries on from there. You'd been grieving for quite a long time, probably already grieved when she first got
we
cancer
grieved in
to a
Florida,
certain
right?
extent. And so you had already done a lot of the work of grieving and you got to do it with Linda and
Mm-hmm.
process with her, which had to be amazing in a way too.
It was such a release and it was an incredible sense of connection because when your intimate partner is dying, much of the intimacy dies before they do. right? And that's one of the topics I like to do speaking gigs on is let's talk about the loss of intimacy so that people who are working with couples who are dying, because when one person dies, the couple dies, of course. When a couple is dying, we need to be able to talk about that and foster whatever kind of physical and emotional intimacy they can still connect to. We were able to do that, but that's because Linda was an ER nurse and she thought that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to do that with Casper because she was a hospice nurse, for God's sakes, right? Every hospice should have a nurse named after a friendly ghost. So we talked about it. And in the times where she was more together than not, which was most of the time, she would talk about her death. She would talk about what she wanted for me. We would talk about my future. We would talk about the fact that this wasn't fair because it wasn't. 3 years is not long enough. And both of them were dead by the age of 58, which is how old I'm going to be next week, which is a little bit weird. So, yeah, it gives you a sense of I get to take them with me because they've told me how they want to be remembered and what they want me to take from them into my new life. I treasure that.
I'm really, your book and your story has caused me to think so much because back to my hospice days when I really feel like, to a large extent, we were not very aware of the grieving, the anticipatory grief of the spouse. I think we were tuned into, oh, the patient is going through all this loss as they're approaching the end of life, but I'm not sure that we paid enough attention to the spouse, and I feel bad about that now. But I think that's very common. I think oftentimes
It's
the spouse
100%.
is overlooked.
It's 100%. The needs, that the intimacy and the physical needs of the couple as a couple. I actually did some research on it. Now, it wasn't university research. It was, I have people around the world on my list. And so I sent them all the same survey. And I sent it to people who work in the profession, as well as grief people, as well as people who had lost spouses or were losing spouses. And 100% of the spouses said, I wish someone would talk about this. And 100% of the providers said, there's no way I'm bringing this up. It's going to feel weird to me. And there's that divide. And at our house, it did come up because we had Casper as our nurse. And so Casper fostered it. The week Linda was dying, she was downstairs in our living room at her choice. She said, she's going to be gone by the end of the week. You need to crawl into bed with her and you guys need to make some body memories. Nobody says that. And then when Casper was dying, I went to work and I came home one day and our bed was literally tied to the hospital bed. Both beds had been pulled out from the sides of the room. So there was walkways on both sides. And that happened because Casper told the nurse, there's going to come a time soon where I won't be able to hold Jill. And I need to be able to do that till the last possible minute. But because of Lewy body, she had a sleep disorder that could be really dangerous. So we had to have the hospital beds so some nights I could protect myself. It's classified as lethal now in the ICD, as a matter of fact. But on the good nights and in the good afternoons, we could drop that barrier down and we could snuggle either across beds or she could crawl into the big bed with me. And that only happened because she, as the patient, spoke up.
Wow. I love that term body memory. I think that's a great term to use that makes it simple for people to understand why that's important, that you have many different types of memories with your loved one, but those memories of physical touch and closeness are precious, and they, as we've said, they're neglected so much during this end of life process.
And they're so important during the grief process, right? That's why when I know couples who are dying or even people who are losing other family members, first thing I say is get the camera out and take the pictures of hand holding. Hold hands and take the picture. Not so much the gel goo and make the hand thing, because that's going to eventually break. Take the pictures. Take a video of you guys holding each other and telling each other some stories. Those will make a difference in the hard moments, especially between 2 and 4 in the morning when everyone else is asleep. Right? So you've got that.
I'm so touched by this because right now in my life, I have a friend who's dealing with her own brain tumor. And so I'm observing her and her spouse as they're going through this process together. And wondering, sometimes it's hard as a friend on the outside to know, what do I say? What could I tell them to make this journey easier? Because I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of how it could unfold and things that might happen, and I know it's
Hmm.
all completely unknown territory for them. So what should I tell them? How should I talk to them about these things?
Ask them if their needs as a couple are being honored by their hospice. And if they don't have hospice yet, make sure they do sooner than later. And make sure it's a really good hospice, because you and I both know there are a lot of hospices that are not the way they should be. So that's important. That's part of why in the book I wrote about how to fire your hospice if you've got a bad one, because you should take charge of that. But as a couple, they need to take the time that they can to record messages so that he's got messages to, I'm assuming it's a
Mm-hmm.
he's got messages to listen to afterward that say, I love you. That's hugely important.
Mm.
Make sure that there are instructions for whoever's going to be there not to take the sheets after she dies. Let him have those and the bedclothes, because people want to be helpful and they want to get busy, and they destroy some of the most precious of stuff that nobody thinks about.
Mm. Such a good
Make
point.
sure that they're talking about what do they want and what does he want, what does she want for him. There's a new book that just came out right now by Rabbi Steve Later.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know him, but I absolutely adore him. You know him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And his new book is basically the an ethical will, but it's written in non-Jewish terms. What do I want for you? How do I want to be remembered? What do I want for your future? And
Mm.
it's literally a workbook. And I don't work for the man, but I love his work, and I recommend that now frequently, because it creates those conversations. I found that it was important for me to be able to just sit with Linda late at night. She couldn't sleep anyway because she worked nights and she couldn't breathe. So you might as well just sit up and talk all night. And we talked about everything. What childhood memories? What did she want for our kids to have memories? What did she want me to do for our grandchildren? Like, all of that I've got.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Hmm. I love that. These are great suggestions. These will be really helpful to me. And I know you emphasized in the book also the importance of the caregiver caring for themselves to make sure they maintain their health. But and you had a lot of really good suggestions there of things I hadn't thought of, but making sure the caregiver doesn't feel guilty asking for certain things, or asking to talk about things, or even wanting to plan out their own future and talk about the fact that they will have a life after the death of the spouse.
Right. Because that's the reality. And you really can't ignore the reality because it's sitting right there. If there's a hospital bed in your house and you've got hospice, somebody's going to die. And as a former hospice social worker and a double widow, die is the term. And so you do have to talk about it and you have to be prepared for it. Linda wrote her own obituary, and she did it with one of my best friends. She didn't want to do it with me. So Wendy came in and sat and did it with her. She planned her own funeral. She set the dress code because she did not want black at her funeral. We wore angel shirts.
Hmm.
Mine said first coach, right? And Hawaiian shirts, right? We had Hawaiian shave ice at Casper's funeral because she loved Hawaii. We did those things to make that a celebration of them, and they could plan their own celebration. Linda wanted a luau to say goodbye to everyone, and she died much too quickly to allow us to do that. Had she lived, we would have had a wake for her while she was still alive.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful. And also, hearing you say that Linda on her bucket list included her thoughts for you, and in a way giving you permission and encouragement to go
Ordered.
on, find another relationship. Don't be alone the rest of your life. Be with someone else. And that she wanted that. She loved you. She wanted you to have that, because you were a young woman, and or well, regardless of what age you were, she just
Right.
wanted you to be with someone.
She knew that I had the kids, and our kids had some, they were all older and came out of foster care. So, there's some stuff that goes with that. Um, but she knew the kids had bonded to Casper and trusted her. And she wanted me to have joy in my life again because she knew just how exhausting her illness had been. And she completely acknowledged it. The problem with all of that is the people in the household know that all of these conversations are happening. And the people, even just right next door, or across the street, or across town, although they consider themselves, best friends or whatever, they're not hearing the conversations and they're not in that space. They're not grieving yet, right?
Hmm.
My girlfriends grieved with me ahead of time because they were there. But most people were just sort of still doing that. But we can still hope. We can, maybe this will go longer. No, it's not. It's not going to go longer. She can't breathe, folks. She had 3% of her lung tissue left when she died,
Hmm.
and her heart was functioning at about 10%. There was not much Linda left, although her sense of humor was there and her great big warm heart was there. And so for her to be able to pack into that, I want Jill and the kids to go have a life. I want Jill to have support. I want Jill to be able to lean on someone. That was important to her. And she knew that. And, we'd had 7 years of illness between the two illnesses. Out of 23 years, that's a significant portion of a life together.
Yes, yes.
Right. And so she wanted me to have that. And I'm very grateful to her for that. And I'm grateful that we had those conversations. We just happen to be a good match, and having a nurse around means things are practical.
That's true. Very true. Well, you made a really good point that people in your outer circle who are not in the middle of everything that's happening, their grief doesn't begin until the death occurs. And so they're completely oblivious to the fact that you've been doing all this anticipatory grief work in advance, and they assume that your grief is beginning at the moment of the
Right
death as
now.
well.
Mm-hmm.
So they overlook the years and months and days and nights of grieving that you've already done in this process
They're
and
not privy
don't
to it. They're not
recognize it.
privy to the back injuries and the shoulder injuries. My left shoulder is thrashed from lifting and carrying, and God help you, wheelchairs. Tip for anyone who's got someone who's sick: get the transfer chair that has the 4 small wheels, because the ones with the big wheels will thrash your shoulder, and you will have that for the rest of your life with you. Right. So I was able to do that grief. I was able to be relieved when she took that last breath. It was stunning. It was mind numbing. I remember sitting in the windowsill thinking, I'm never going to get to 4 months. But by 4 months, I was really, really okay because we'd done all that grieving. And the cool thing about marrying someone who knew your late wife is they knew your late wife and you can talk about her.
Yeah, that's true. They're actually part of your
Mm-hmm.
grieving process as well, not a total stranger to it.
Casper made sure that, we were on Veterans Day, that I took the kids to the cemetery and put up the flag for the Navy for Linda because she was retired Navy. And she made sure the kids brought Linda's memory into every single event because she wanted to honor Linda. And not many folks understand that who are outside that system.
Hmm.
They see it as replacement, like when the dog dies and you get a new dog, which dog people all know you're not replacing, you're adding to, that you don't replace. But other people outside the system don't get it. And so for them, it's a challenge because they don't see that you are, in fact, continuing the love you had for your late spouse in the context of the relationship with the new spouse, who you also love in a different way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense to my brain.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. And I wanted to talk a little bit about first, as I said before, your book is so helpful. It's full of tips that come directly from your experience, I can tell,
Boots on the
and
ground.
tips for caregivers. A couple of, you talk a lot about setting boundaries, which I think many caregivers have a problem with. And one was the one thing you did was make lists of things you need people to do. So a list so you could just hand it to people. Here, do these things to help me.
Right?
And then a list of things not to talk about. I loved both of those.
Don't talk to kids whose parent is dying about the parent dying. Talk about school, take them to the mall as long as they're wearing a mask these days, right? Do the things that kids need to do. Don't tell them that they should be grateful that they're going to have an angel in heaven. Please don't ever say that, right? And it's important if you're losing a spouse to have help. And one thing that caregivers don't do universally is ask for help. Oh no, I got this. I can take it. Nope, I can do that too. Right? I was traveling for work, seeing foster kids in Northern California by plane with Linda at home with one of the kids. And I'm thinking back at it, I was like sheer insanity. And I finally had to say, no, I need help. I need someone to come in and do these things and these things. And I don't have the energy to get them to youth group. Can someone pick them up and take them to youth group tonight? Right? I need someone to mow my lawn. I need people. And that gives people who want to help an opportunity to help within the context that they're able to do.
That's so true. And I like the idea of having a written list
Mhm.
because you can hand it to them and they get to choose of
Take your
from
choice,
the menu what they would
right?
like to offer when they step up, because so many people do come forward. Let me know what I could do. What can I do? And that, it seems like that's a nice easy way to say, here's what I need. And you don't have to
Right.
constantly talk about it or talk through the list. You have it written down and you can show it to them.
Set up a meal. Can you be in charge of setting up a meal train? We didn't have those when mine were sick, but can you do that? Can you take over my phone? Can you answer my emails that are, things people wanting updates? Because I don't have the energy. It's mind-boggling to me that when someone is losing their spouse, that other people are expecting individual responses about how things are going. You don't have the energy for that.
Yeah, you're right about that, that sometimes the caregiver is expected to also take care of other people who
Yeah.
are upset and grieving and wishing for more information. The caregiver ends up being the point person that other people come to expecting some kind of support and help from the already exhausted caregiver.
Or the griever. I have those conversations every single day with my clients, whether they're in the process of losing or they've already lost. And they're mind blown that someone would say, I'm so sorry about your loss. It's really hard for me. Can you help me? And so we practice. I really can't. I'm sure you've got people outside your circle that you can reach out to, but I need the support right now. And if you can't support me, then, we can catch up in a few months. Boundaries.
Yes, perfect.
Put
So
that hula hoop around you and keep it tight.
so important. And it's not rude, it's not thoughtless, it's essential.
Self
And
care.
exactly.
Self
And
care is not a spa.
and part of this problem is other people just don't know. They don't know better.
Mhm.
They don't know that they're burdening the caregiver or the griever. They don't know they're asking for too much. They can't see that. So we have to show them. We have to point it out to them.
Right. And they think they're being helpful by saying, tell me what you need. But the caregiver knows they're saying that because it makes them feel good to say it, but there's a large chance that they don't actually have the energy or the inclination to do that. And they've got a busy life too, right? And then after the funeral, the grieving widow looks around and everyone's gone back to real life and they're trying to rebuild their life. But if they do it in a way that upsets everybody else's widow rules, then those people have time and energy to come back and tell you about
Hmm.
it,
Ah,
right?
yes.
And it's not fair. If someone is going to lose their spouse, they get to decide what they want to do with the rest of their life because they're the ones that have been left behind.
Yeah, so true. Another really novel suggestion that I read in your book, you mentioned that you found adults to connect with your children as they were going through Linda's dying process and after her death, other adults outside the family who could kind of help look after them. So, talk about that a little bit.
I'm a social worker, so I tend to micromanage a little bit. I will admit that. And so I knew we were going to have a crowd, and I had three kids. And I knew I needed to focus on Linda, and I knew these would be my last hours at some point with her as well. And so I spoke individually to people I trusted and assigned one of those people to each of my children. The children didn't know it, but the adults did. And they all committed to being there regardless of the day or time when she was dying. And those folks kept an eye on the kids and sidled up to the kids. And then when that child looked like they were in distress, that adult simply plucked that child out of the room and took them off to the side and got them something cold to drink or hung out with them in the front. They spent time with them. Those same people had eyes on them at the funeral so that if it got to be too much, that adult could take that child and exit. And each of the kids at some point needed their adult. And it was hugely helpful to me because then I could focus where I needed to be, which was on my dying wife.
Exactly, because as a wife and a mother, you couldn't possibly have the time or energy to care for all of those people who needed you. And definitely the kids needed attention as well. It just couldn't come from you in that moment. And I think that was really brilliant to have people who knew them well, who
Mm-hmm.
would recognize when they might need something else that you were not able to provide. Because think of all the stories we hear of people who talk back in their childhood when they had a parent die and no one tended
Was
to
there
them.
with them.
No one was with them. No one talked to them. No
And they were
one.
afraid to go to their other parent because they were distressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. They need someone.
Yes. And that's so brilliant to actually plan it and ask adults who know the child, please be there for this child only. You just have one child to look
Yeah.
after,
Everybody
but
gets a kid.
it's part of your job, and that's how you're going to help this whole situation. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but I would imagine that really helped the grief process for your children as well.
It helped their grief process and it helped the helper too, because the ones that I asked to do that helping were people who were not necessarily comfortable with grief and loss, but they were steadfast with my kiddos and part of their lives. And those folks really helped them get through those really hard moments. And it meant that while Linda was dying, she died on Good Friday of all days. Um, and I had all three of my kids and my niece and nephew and my twin nieces and the cats and the dog. Like everybody was on this hospital bed. I don't know how everybody fit. And I was kind of perched on a windowsill, leaning over Linda. But I knew that all I had to do was look up and I could catch the eye of those adults and they could come and grab the kid. And that when Linda did die, that those adults could take those kids when they were ready to leave the room, underline when they were ready, and hang out with them a little bit and steady them up a little bit. And likewise at the funeral, I walked in. And of course, they always have the front row assigned to the family, right? Well, we have a big family, so there were like 4 rows. I took the front row, and I ended up there by myself with all three of my children and my niece and nephew and a giant stuffed frog that we had bought my niece and nephew for Christmas years ago. And I didn't have enough arms. And I was speaking and they were all speaking. And it felt like a business management system more than a funeral for a little bit there until I remembered I had the helpers.
Mm.
And then I could say, Sherry, will you take Carrie? Just I could whisper and a zing, she was gone. Right. And that helped. Our youth minister came down from the front of the church to sit with one of our kids because she
Mm.
was one of the helpers. It helped. I can't recommend that enough to anybody who's facing a loss.
Yeah, that's very nice. And it's the first time I've ever heard that suggestion before. So that's something about your book. It's full of things that I haven't thought of before or heard
It's
about, which is
just
why
boots on the ground.
but it's so valuable to anyone going through this. And I want to back up a little bit because one of the early chapters is on receiving the diagnosis and having just experienced this with my friend.
Right.
This is really the first time in my life when someone I love has I've witnessed receiving a terminal diagnosis. So, in spite of all this hospice work, dealing with all kinds of
That's
other
well
people,
after that
so
moment.
so different when you witness the moment, and it was challenging and devastating in so many ways. So, I wanted to have you just talk a little bit about that and share some of your wisdom.
The date of diagnosis is, it's funny, it's got the same initials as date of death, DOD. And it feels very much like the beginning of the other DOD. And sometimes folks are expecting it, sometimes they're not. I had no idea that pulmonary fibrosis even existed, although it kills a tremendous number of people and it's 100% fatal, and 60% don't survive the first 6 weeks.
Hmm.
So we were ahead of the game already with that. Um, but I remember standing in that hallway, and then a second time when Linda went into heart failure, because PF also tans your lungs, which tans your heart, so your heart can't beat normally. So you end up in heart failure as well. So we were at the cardiologist, and he said, yeah, she has right sided heart failure. She's just going to die sooner. Take her home. And again, you already know she's dying, but there's that, what did you just say? It's a stunning, jarring moment for your brain. And for the spouse, it's a little bit about, oh crap, now what about me? Which reverts immediately to, I need to caretake right now. I need to be the supportive spouse. I need to make sure that I respond in a way that meets your needs, not my needs. Because I'm a social worker, I'm going to hug you, but not everyone's a hugger. My current wife is definitely not from a huggy family, right? So their first response is not to hug, it's to stand by and sit for a moment and breathe. But what do you do with that? And how do you incorporate that? And after Linda and I met with her pulmonologist, who was a friend of hers, and he told us, you are now hospice. You're going to be pushing up daisies soon. There's nothing you can do. And those were the words he used.
Wow.
We went to a place here in Riverside called the Mission Inn, which is just beautiful, and has a really old bar from the turn of the last century. And we had a glass of the most expensive Cabernet they had, and sat for a moment and just sort of went through where our life had been and what this meant for us and how she wanted to manage it. And we texted the kids and said, we're going to be back late. And immediately they knew she was dying. It wasn't even a question, it was a statement. And when we got that moment with Casper, it took forever to get her diagnosed because neurologists are not great with dementia. Point of order for any neurologist listening, you need to be better at dementia and much better at Lewy body. It takes an average of 5 neurologists to get that diagnosis right.
Wow.
And it took us 3 years out of 3.5. And I was the one who had to suggest the diagnosis.
Hmm.
And when he finally said the words, and I love that neurologist, he was the best one we ever had. Um, we went out, and Casper was with it enough to say that was the bad one, right? That's the one we didn't want. Yep. So how much time do I have and how much time do we have? And then we had lunch and she choked. And I started to get up. Here comes Heimlich Jilly, right? And she said, sit down. And she said, and no feeding tubes. Don't even think about it. I'm like, how many people would go from choking to no feeding tube?
A nurse.
A nurse is exactly right. And so we got her pulsed form done right away and got the doctor to co-sign it that day. So nobody would do a feeding tube. And at the end of her life, she went 37 days without food or fluid. And I had to
Wow.
look at that pulse over and over and over again to know that I was doing what she wanted. And I stood by it, which is no mean feat for a caregiver, because other people are making all kinds of suggestions about how you're killing your loved one,
Yeah, I was
right?
going to say that's also an area where there are plenty of rules that other people want to impose on you.
Right. you're killing her, you're keeping her from having fluid, and that's not true, but you have to know end of life, and that's where we need to have conversations more.
Yeah.
And that's why I wrote the book, because I had tons of blogs I wrote, and I talked to an editor and she said, Jill, you don't want an autobiography. No one wants to read that. Nobody. They want to know what to do. And so the book was written for folks who are managing an illness that's going to be terminal, managing hospice, managing the dying process, because nobody talks about that. And then managing your own grief and doing it your way so that other people don't try to manage you. Because there
And
aren't books like that.
no, not at all. And another aspect that you write about is facing all these challenges as a same sex couple, which I know there are obstacles there as well that you have to overcome.
And there are growing obstacles because of the current political situation. It's going to only get worse from here. We were on the cusp of Prop 8. Linda and I fought Prop 8. Linda and I celebrated the end of Prop 8 for that a brief moment. That's how we managed to be legally married. And then when she died, Prop 8 died for us. And then Casper and I couldn't get legally married until Prop 8 died at the Supreme Court. And so when Linda had her first surgeries in Florida, we had powers of attorney, durable power of attorney, all the documents you could ever have. And all the nurses there had to say was, yeah, well, we don't believe you're a couple, so we're going to disregard all of it. And that's exactly what happened. I was
Wow.
locked out of her hospital room. The nurse blocked the door with a bed. And hear me correctly, I love nurses. I've been married to two of them, but some of them just need to not be in the profession. And she was one of them. Um, it's easy to be discriminated against in so many ways, and it's easy for people to discriminate without telling you they're discriminating. We were delayed on getting Linda's legal disability paperwork because the nurse practitioner at her pulmonologist's office disagreed with our marriage. Like she had some power to disagree. So I had to finally get the raw paperwork from the office. And she had crossed out the word wife and spouse on every page and wrote significant other in quotes, like they say they're significant others. Because she wasn't going to give the documents to me. She was going to let us go without income. She was going to let
Wow.
me not be able to feed my children because she had a need to discriminate, which is mind boggling to me.
It's alarming to me that even having documentation and legal power of attorney and healthcare proxy forms, all of those, that could be just disregarded.
When Casper had to have a heart procedure, they did a heart cath, and they were still trying to figure out what was going on with her. And we were legally married at that point. Um, we checked in, and the person in registration at our local hospital said, "Do you have your marriage license?" And I looked at her, and it was the same hospital where Linda had worked and had worked for many, many years. So they still knew me. And I'm a rabble rouser. I've been in every newspaper, I've been on every news channel. You Google me, you will find me. Um, so the other person in registration knew who I was. And that saved us because she pulled that registration clerk aside and said, "You are messing with the wrong couple. They're going to sue us and you." And all I had to say was, "Did you ask them for their marriage license? Because I heard you just say they're married." And she tried to say, "I have a right to ask." And I said, "We're going to go. You're going to be sorry." They switched out clerks. They took our marital status and we were married again. But they can erase you just like that.
Yeah. Oh, that hurts. It hurts to hear that story and to see that even within the medical system, there's that much discrimination. And how much awful burden does that add to your caregiver journey and the grief that you're experiencing already?
And how much does it scare the patient who's afraid that if you've upset the caregiving staff, that they're going to then in turn retaliate, right? So Casper was afraid to have me step out even for a second because she was afraid they were going to retaliate against her. And that's a real fear. I slept at the hospital in Florida because Linda was afraid to be alone once we had pushed the envelope on Jill gets to know what's going on. Her surgeon refused to give me her pathology report. He said, I told her what I found. Like, she was asleep, dude.
Hmm.
She's been in surgery for 4 hours. I told her, you can wait. And he could. He could do that. And he did, because that's the way that he believed. His beliefs overrode our relationship as a married couple and my need to be able to take care of my spouse.
Wow. I'm curious, as you having worked in hospice, did you experience any of that kind of discrimination within hospice from hospice staffs? Because my hope is that hospice is a little more inclusive, but I don't know. I don't know for
You
sure.
know, our hospice that we had for Linda turned into the hospice that I went back to work for in hospice. I didn't see any discrimination. I saw nothing but profound respect for her. Our doctor was and is an exceptional hospice doc. He's the one who goes out and sees his patients, right? He knows every one of his patients. And he recently took care of my late father in law. But when Casper was dying, the staff came and said goodbye to her, and she was a beloved nurse there. And one of the nurses who'd cared for Linda too, I walked her down the stairs after she'd come to say goodbye. And she said, she was looking at our wedding picture, which was in our hall stairwell. And she said, you know, I never believed in marriage for you guys, and I still don't. I totally disagree with it. I'm glad you had each other, but I disagree with your relationship. Now, why she had a need to tell me that while my spouse was dying upstairs, someone that she had worked with and called on hundreds of times. Casper had saved her butt a couple of times, but she still had a need
Hmm.
because of her beliefs to tell me what her beliefs were and to vomit them all over me. And I was like, bye.
Wow.
So it's there. You just don't always see it. And you're right, hospice staff are completely different. When I worked for hospice in Florida, we had a huge number of AIDS patients. And I saw our staff who belonged to some of the most fundamentalist churches step right up and show the greatest of care and dignity and love for our patients. And no questions asked. I saw one young man who was dying who literally made himself die 12 hours earlier so his dad couldn't get his ashes because
Hmm.
he knew his dad was on the way from Ohio and he needed to be cremated right away so his mom and his partner could get his ashes and go scatter him before his dad could get there because his dad was hateful. And our staff just stepped right up and cared for these folks. But it's there, like in every community, it's there. And, in the mortuary community, my wife Stacy saw lots of discrimination and heard lots of stuff in the back room.
Hmm.
The trans community faces that all the time right now with being misgendered after death.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
In
I've,
California,
yeah.
we have a law now that says the way that a person presents is how they have to be presented after death. But in other states, not so much. Right? Stan
Yeah.
can become Susan again and be wearing a dress and a casket.
Yeah. It's shocking that we're still dealing with this amount of
And it's only going to
discrimination.
get worse again.
Yeah.
Our current Supreme Court seems to be bound and determined. So I'm fearful, and I don't use that word lightly. I am very much fearful about what's coming. We've had more than one discussion in our backyard at coffee time about when retirement comes, is there another country?
Hmm.
And I didn't want to have those conversations. I'm caring for my mom with dementia next door right now. We can't go anywhere. I have grandchildren here. And we have 6 poodles right now who are seniors who need care, and you can't take them just about anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a scary time, and the discrimination is going to come back.
Yeah. Unfortunately. So we all
Mm-hmm.
need to be aware of it, and we need to be aware of the impact that it has on individuals and their lives.
And we need to make sure that when we're in hospice teams and we're in IDT meetings, that we are referring to couples as couples and not only caring for them as a couple, but also making sure we're reinforcing for everyone around the table that this is a couple, and regardless of who the couple is, they deserve all the same support, care, and dignity for their relationship. All of it.
Exactly. I mean, that's basic human goodness and
You'd
dignity.
think,
Yeah.
you would think, right? And we need to make sure that when someone is in grief work with that hospice, that we're acknowledging who it was they lost and then supporting them in whatever they want to do in their grief, not what we think they should do in their grief,
Exactly. And
right?
allow them to be the rebellious widow.
To be the rebellious widow and to adopt all the senior poodles on the planet or whatever they're going to do. Walter is staring at me right now. He has no eyes.
Well, one thing I really appreciate from our conversation and from your book is your use of humor, and you emphasize that how important humor is. And even during these really challenging, dark times of life, humor can make all the difference.
It does. And it's the only way, that's the way hospice staff keep themselves emotionally healthy. I have found with great love the and reverence the sick and twisted humor that hospice people have behind closed doors and on cell phones and text messages, because it's self-preservation and it helped us a lot. And I use humor with my grievers because grievers don't have people laugh with them very often, right? They get that look. People say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss," and they screw up their face. And they, even when you're wearing a mask, you can see the look and imagine what they're looking like. Grievers want to have some laughter in their lives, and they need to. We know it changes our endorphins. We know it changes our cardiac system. We know it clears our heads. We need to really work toward that. You don't want fake humor, but you definitely want to have some humor introduced. And it's a great way to talk about intimacy with a dying partner, because you can ask, all right, which one of you made the first move?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Humor and yet also looking at the intimate part. And it works really well.
Yeah, that's great. A great way to tie those together. And I think
Mm-hmm.
just giving ourselves permission to laugh, whether we're a caregiver or we're a care provider coming into the situation,
Right.
to know that there's permission to see the humorous in any event and to bring that up.
Right. And to, we had one of my favorite hospice nurses, Jenny, I said, I really don't want to be doing this anymore. This is really awful. I hate this. She said, I get it. You are doing what you have to do with the situation you've been handed. You didn't get to vote on it. We don't either, but we'll get through it, Jill. We'll get through it. And then she said, what's the hardest part? And I said, actually cooking the dog food, because we've always cooked our dog's food at home. And the next day, a nurse showed up with packages of home cooked dog food, and
Oh.
they were labeled. So one of them said naughty reindeer, and one of them said chickens who talked back. And right, so we, even just in that, the humor was injected. And so every time we opened a bag, we had a little moment of a smile. It doesn't take much to inject the humor into the situation in a most appropriate way and to lighten it up a little bit.
Hmm. Such a good point. A good thing for all of us to remember, as I mean, looking back on this entire interview and all the things we've covered. Wow, your information and your that you share and your wisdom is just so valuable, Jill, and I'm really grateful to you for that.
I'm grateful that you have this podcast. It helps a lot of people. And we both know how very little the conversations happen about grief and loss and death and dying. And I remember saying 40 years ago, we need to talk about this more. And I'm still saying it. I'm like, seriously, it's been 40 years. What happened?
I know
Why
we're
are we
still
still where we are?
still trying to make a difference.
Still trying to make it part of everyday conversation, which is where it belongs.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little more about your other books. I know, well, first of all, with The Rebellious Widow, where can people get that?
Everything's available on Amazon. The Rebellious Widow is also available on at therebelliouswidow.com. And I'm available at jilljohnsonyoung.com, which sounds really weird to me because social workers are not generally .coms. but now I'm a .com. And you can also find me at centralcounselingservices.com. And I see people only in California because of state laws, but you can find the books on Amazon. I've got books for children about my pet is sick. It's time to say goodbye. Someone I love is sick. And then someone I love just died. They are written for children, but in words that children understand and appreciate. They have hand-drawn artwork with an artist that I found in South America who's amazing. And so they show things like someone in a hospital bed, and they talk about it's okay to ask the person there to help you get into the bed so that you don't hurt your loved one, but you can crawl into bed and hug them. People around you are grouchy right now. It's not because of you. You're going to go to something called a visitation, probably. Make sure you don't have to wear scratchy clothes and that you get to go out for ice cream afterwards. I totally set up parents for ice cream and donuts in these books. I'm just flat out. Ice cream and donuts are
preparation.
Featured.
Okay.
Right? Don't fall in the hole at the cemetery. It'll scare your mom. You can walk up to the casket, but you don't have to. Don't let anyone make you kiss the dead person. It talks about cremation. It talks about a year after and remembering someone. They talk about the real life stuff.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jill Johnson Young. I really appreciated this reminder that each of us grieves in our own way, and we need to make sure we're leaving space for everyone to have their own individual process when they're grieving a loved one, however that might unfold and whatever it might consist of for that person, and to make sure that we're being accepting and loving and kind toward anyone who's grieving, no matter how that grief seems to manifest in their life, since, as we all know, there is not just one right way to grieve. And Jill gave us some great reminders about that, but also I was alarmed to hear about some of the issues that she and both of her wives faced as same-sex couples. And I feel like this deserves our attention, our concern, our compassion, even our activism to make sure that everyone is treated fairly within our healthcare system, and to make sure we're standing up for all of those who are marginalized. And there are many other groups who have experienced similar discrimination in all aspects of our healthcare system. So I find this story to be heartbreaking, really, and it just reminds me to be paying attention wherever I go and to make sure that we're talking about these issues so that this kind of discrimination is not going unseen or being ignored. So I hope you enjoyed this particular interview, and if you like this content, I hope you'll share it with other people who might also benefit from listening in. Just share episodes with them or show them how to find the podcast on whatever podcast app they happen to have on their phone. It's also helpful if you subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you happen to be listening. And as I mentioned before, you can support the podcast in multiple ways. You can go to my website, eoluniversity.com/support, and there you'll find links for supporting through Patreon with a one-time PayPal donation, or a way to just buy me a cup of coffee. If you're interested in doing that, I appreciate all of you who have stepped up over the past years to help out this podcast. So until we're together next week, remember that we're here for love. So keep that in mind, no matter who you interact with, no matter where you go, and face your fear. Be ready, because life will throw something at you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.